Number 15. Rafael dos Anjos was on a 3-fight winning streak and was the number 1 contender to face then UFC lightweight champion Anthony Pettis. Anthony Pettis had looked sensational with victories over Benson Henderson and Gilbert Melendez. Nobody gave Rafael dos Anjos a chance against Anthony Pettis. Both fighters faced off at UFC 185, where Rafael dos Anjos put a beating on Anthony Pettis for all of the 5 rounds, becoming the new UFC lightweight champion of the world. Number 14. Cain Velasquez had destroyed all of his competition in the UFC heavyweight division. He had just won the UFC heavyweight title from Brock Lesnar at UFC 121 and was coming off a 1-year layoff after suffering a shoulder injury. He was scheduled to face number 1 contender Junior Dos Santos at UFC on Fox 1. During the fight, Junior Dos Santos shocked the world when he defeated Cain Velasquez by knockout at 1 minute 4 seconds of the first round, becoming the new UFC heavyweight champion of the world. Number 13. Holm had just knocked out the dominant champion Ronda Rousey at UFC 193 to become the new UFC Women's Bantamweight champion. She was quickly scheduled to face number 1 contender at that time, Miesha Tate, who was on a 4-fight winning streak with victories over Liz Carmouche, Ren Nakai, Sarah McMahon and Jessica Ai. Both fighters were scheduled to face each other at UFC 196. During the fight, Holm had dominated 4 rounds of the fight until the 5th round, where Miesha Tate made a shocking comeback and defeated Holm by a rear naked choke, becoming the new UFC Women's Bantamweight champion of the world. Number 12. Frankie Edgar had earned himself a shot against then UFC lightweight champion BJ Penn at UFC 112. No one gave Frankie Edgar a chance at BJ Penn, as BJ Penn had looked so dominant in the UFC lightweight division. During the fight, Frankie Edgar's speed and his volume striking was too much for BJ Penn to handle. Frankie Edgar earned himself a unanimous decision, becoming the new UFC lightweight champion of the world. Number 11. Eddie Alvarez defeated Anthony Pettis at UFC Fight Night 81 to earn himself a shot at then UFC lightweight champion Rafael dos Anjos. Rafael dos Anjos had looked dominant with victories over Benson Henderson, Nate Diaz, Anthony Pettis and Donald Cerrone. Both fighters faced off at UFC Fight Night 90, where Eddie Alvarez defeated Rafael dos Anjos by TKO in the first round, becoming the new UFC lightweight champion of the world. Number 10. Conor McGregor was set to face then UFC featherweight king Jose Aldo at UFC 189 for the title. An injury forced him out of the fight with just 2 weeks away from the event. Chad Mendes stepped in on short notice to face Conor McGregor for the interim UFC featherweight title. Conor McGregor defeated Chad Mendes by TKO in the 2nd round, becoming the interim UFC featherweight champion. He eventually faced Jose Aldo at UFC 194 in a title unification bout. He knocked out Jose Aldo in just 13 seconds of the first round, becoming the undisputed UFC featherweight champion of the world, which is the fastest title fight in UFC history. Number 9. Both Gabriel Gonzaga and Mirko were scheduled to face each other at UFC 70 to decide the next number 1 contender for the UFC heavyweight title. Mirko had just won the 2006 Pride Openweight Grand Prix tournament, and many thought that he was easily going to defeat Gabriel Gonzaga. During the fight, Gabriel Gonzaga knocked out Mirko by a head kick, becoming the number 1 contender for the UFC heavyweight title. Number 8. Fabricio Werdum was set to face then UFC heavyweight champion Cain Velasquez for the heavyweight title at UFC 180, but a knee injury forced Cain Velasquez to withdraw from the event. Mark Hunt stepped in on short notice to face Fabricio Werdum for the interim UFC heavyweight title. Fabricio Werdum defeated Mark Hunt by a flying knee in the 2nd round, becoming the interim UFC heavyweight champion. Both fighters were scheduled again to face off in a title unification bout at UFC 188. Fabricio Werdum defeated Cain Velasquez by a guillotine choke in the 3rd round, becoming the undisputed UFC heavyweight champion of the world. Number 7. Tyron Woodley was given the shot at then UFC welterweight champion Robbie Lawler at UFC 201. Robbie Lawler was destroying all his opponents and had victories over Rory McDonald, Carlos Condit and Johnny Hendricks. In the fight, Tyron Woodley defeated Robbie Lawler by knockout in the 1st round, becoming the new UFC welterweight champion of the world. Number 6. Renan Barão looked so dominant in the UFC bantamweight division and was defeating top fighters with ease. He was scheduled to defend his UFC bantamweight title against Rafael Assunção at UFC 173. A rib injury forced Rafael Assunção to withdraw from the event. TJ Dillashaw stepped in as a late replacement. During the fight, TJ Dillashaw defeated Renan Barão by TKO in the 5th round to become the new UFC bantamweight champion of the world. Number 5. Luke Rockhold was scheduled to defend his UFC middleweight title against Chris Weidman at UFC 199. A neck injury forced Chris Weidman out of his title fight. Michael Bisping stepped in on short notice to face the champion in the main event. Luke Rockhold had already defeated Michael Bisping at UFC Fight Night 55 by a guillotine choke in the second round. Since then, Michael Bisping had defeated CB Dollaway, Talis Laitis and Anderson Silva. No one gave a chance to Michael Bisping winning the title. When both fighters faced off at UFC 199, Michael Bisping knocked out Luke Rockhold in the first round, shocking the world, becoming the new UFC middleweight champion of the world. Number 4. Conor McGregor was set to face Rafael dos Anjos for the UFC Lightweight Championship at UFC 196. A foot injury caused Rafael dos Anjos to be removed from the event. Nate Diaz stepped in on 2 weeks' notice. Nobody gave Nate Diaz a chance against Conor McGregor, as Conor McGregor looked so dominant inside the octagon. In the fight, Nate Diaz submitted Conor McGregor in the second round of the fight, shocking the world. Number 3. Matt Serra earned himself a title shot against then UFC welterweight champion George St. Pierre at UFC 69 after winning the Ultimate Fighter the comeback. Nobody thought that Matt Serra had a chance against George St. Pierre. In the fight, Matt Serra knocked out George St. Pierre in the first round, becoming the new UFC welterweight champion of the world. Number 2. Anderson Silva was the long-reigning UFC middleweight champion. He had faced everyone in the middleweight division and was undefeated in the UFC. His spectacular victories over his opponents made him look untouchable inside the octagon. He was scheduled to defend his middleweight title for the 10th time against Chris Weidman at UFC 162. Many believed that it would be another highlight reel finish for Anderson Silva and didn't give Chris Weidman any credit for his skills. In the fight, Chris Weidman defeated Anderson Silva by knockout in the second round, shocking the world, becoming the new UFC middleweight champion of the world. Number 1. Ronda Rousey was the long-reigning UFC Women's Bantamweight champion. She had basically cleared out the division and had won her last 3 fights in under a minute. She was scheduled to defend a UFC Bantamweight title against Holly Holm at UFC 193. Holly Holm was undefeated at that time and had 2 victories in the UFC. Many expected Ronda Rousey to win easily and didn't give Holly Holm a chance in the fight. Holly Holm shocked the world when she defeated Ronda Rousey by knockout in the second round at UFC 193, becoming the new UFC Women's Bantamweight champion of the world, which may arguably be the biggest upset in UFC history.